Hello, all, and congratulations on your award with the CTR. I'm here today to talk to you about your pending submissions to your institutional IRBs and how potentially to get those done in the easiest way possible. I'm sure you all realize that IRB's sole responsibility is for the protection of participants who are going to participate in your research. In order to start, what I'd like to do is give you a little bit of background on why we have these kinds of protections and how important it is to have ethical base to research. Historically, we'll go back a little bit to what happened in World War II. What we found were some of the most notorious uses of human subjects in science known to history during this time. Government spending on research was at an all-time high, and that included medical research. And unfortunately, at this time, it produced unprecedented horrors and a callous disregard for human life in the name of scientific research. What the Nazis did during this time was use medical experiments in concentration camps. Many of the studies were designed to provide information on how soldiers could survive different battlefield environments. I'm sure you realize that the participants in these experiments were not consented in any way and didn't have a choice. Basically, they were just picked out of a line and used. Now, as we think about this historically, you can go back to something as heinous as the Nazi regime, but unfortunately, you will also find some in our own history here in the United States. Between 1932 and 1972, the Tuskegee syphilis experiments went on. What happened here was that male Negroes were not treated for syphilis and were not given the option of treatment when treatment became available. There was no autonomy associated with this particular research. What happened was, after it was over, that it really heightened the awareness of the need to protect human subjects and to ensure that they voluntarily consent to participate. One of the things that's very clear is that at any point in time, when a person is engaged in research, that they have the option to remove themselves from it. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the foundation that these types of things brought to us as far as the regulatory environment. The Nuremberg Code in 1947 came out of World War II. And what that did is it provided us the means to use informed consent, reduce coercion, and make sure that scientific methods were properly used for experimentation. Another key piece that you will hear more about later is beneficence toward the experiment participants. The Declaration of Helsinki in 1964 by the World Medical Association developed the first standards of ethical principles stated in the Nuremberg Code and tied them to the physician's Hippocratic Oath. The Belmont Report, which came out in 1979, identified the basic ethical principles that should underline the conduct of biomedical and behavioral research involving human subjects, and developed the guidelines which should be followed to assure such research is conducted in accordance with those principles. U.S. regulations are engaged through three different means. The first is the Common Rule, which set forth the regulatory guidelines for all research done through the Department of Health and Human Services, and is paired with FDA, which controls all investigational products, including drugs as well as instruments. And then we have protection of health information, which is based in HIPAA. Let's go back a little bit to the Belmont Report and the guiding ethical principles that we make sure provide oversight to all research that is done and is the foundation for what an IRB will look at when reviewing your protocols. The first one is respect for persons, which essentially is informed consent. It's to treat individuals as autonomous agents and allow people to choose for themselves. Do not use people as a means to an end. As I said earlier, one of the key things that we find in respect for persons is that their participation is voluntary and their withdrawal from research is voluntary, and coercion cannot be used in order to get them to remain. Second principle that is critical is beneficence. That is that the IRB must do risk-benefit analysis. So we have to weigh any risk that is potentially associated with the research with a potential benefit. Make sure you identify risk and benefit when you do submissions to an IRB. It is critical. Sometimes there is risk, but if the benefit outweighs that risk, then it's a formula that we look at to make sure that it's okay to go ahead. And finally, justice. It's appropriate selection of subjects. We want to treat people fairly, and we want to make sure that access is available appropriately to people participating in research. Okay, so how does this kind of get away from our traditional model now that you're going to be engaged in participatory research? Well, based on our friends in the cartoon here, if it's not participatory action research, what is it? Well, dictatorial inaction research, alienated sedentary research, autocratic twiddle your thumbs research. Why we find that kind of funny is the fact that traditional models have a tendency to be dictatorial. What happens is that a researcher comes up with an idea, they develop a hypothesis, and then they start to recruit participants in order to implement their research to either prove or dismiss their hypothesis. So you're not really engaging them in the research itself and its development. So why focus on translational research? Because we found that U.S. health outcomes are no better than outcomes in other industrialized countries, and we need to identify a way to get research from bedside to curbside more quickly. So one way to do that is to strengthen the linkages between the research, the practice, and the communities. And one of the main strategies for that was community-engaged research. Now, when we ask ourselves, what is community-engaged research? Well, from that, we have a continuum to give you a better understanding. And I'm sure some of you have seen these before. When we look at the continuum involving how the community may function within your research, at one end, you have outreach, which is really primarily closer to the traditional, which is communication flows from the academic agency to the community, basically inform or share them the research is going to occur. It provides the community with information and then identifies what the outcomes are for that research. As we go down the continuum, you'll see to consult, to involve, and now we get more closely related to community-based participatory research, which has a stronger bidirectional relationship. So what's happening here is that you're forming partnerships within the community, building trust, and hopefully having them more engaged in developing what your research is going to do and how it is going to function. Probably the complete other end of the spectrum is community-driven research, which is really strong community leadership may reach out to an academic partner and ask for help in their understanding problems that are associated with their community. And so the research really totally reflects the needs and the desires of the community as opposed to a hypothesis solely developed by a researcher. All right, now, what does this mean from an IRB perspective? Well, there are no particular guiding principles from the Institutional Review Board towards community research that isn't already being done towards basic research. One of the most interesting things is that we ask from an IRB perspective is that the scientists should realize the goals are not necessarily the same. Where you might be existing in a publish-or-perish environment, the community is not interested at all in that particular type of engagement. They're interested in how do I resolve a problem associated with our community. So as you're developing, reviewing your protocols, we want to point out some considerations for you because there are no distinctive rules, as I mentioned earlier, between models of research that the IRB has to follow. We make sure that it is ethical and that it fits the regulations sought for by Department of Health and Human Services and the Common Rule, FDA, and HIPAA. So as protocols are being developed, we want you to think of some things that the IRB may ask. That is, what is the extent of the community's involvement in the selection of the research question, the research objectives? In other words, how will the community be engaged and how are those participants protected? And are they, in fact, part of the research team? And if so, do they have training to be a member of the research team? Okay, what are the different definitions of the problem presented by various constituents in the community? What was the process for understanding what those problems were? What is the justification for research? And what are the concrete action outcomes? Who in the community will benefit from the research, and what will that look like? From a methodology standpoint, we're going to ask this: how will the community be involved in the research? For example, in data collection, analysis, dissemination. What is the level of training that will occur for the community researchers? Here's a great example, and that is consenting. Consenting is an art unto itself. You have to be very careful that scripts are followed when you are consenting participants for research. And if community members are going to be doing consenting, they're going to have to be trained properly on how to do that. Will the method include consideration for literacy issues? Are you going to be working across cultures? Are there going to be language barriers? Do you need some other types of materials that are going to be multiple language accessible? Next, if questionnaires and surveys are going to be used, how is the community engaged in the process of developing these instruments to make sure they are appropriate for the community that they are going to be accessing them? How will science and inclusion be balanced in developing the appropriate methodologies? So that's from the methodological perspective. Who are the research participants? Sometimes, for example, it may be a community such as obese individuals living in a high poverty area in a certain zip code. Other times it may be school-aged children who ride the bus more than 3 hours a day. The community may be defined by a disorder, a condition, a geographic zone, an ethnic race group, a political group, or any number of possibilities. The research participant must be clearly defined. So again, we want to ask, how are you defining community? One of those potential things, it's a group with a sense of belonging or membership. 2, common experiences and a history linked to place. 3, emotional, spiritual connection. 4, fulfillment of individual and social needs. 5, influence. The individual and community feel that they matter. 6, positive valuing of unity, diversity, and cultural pluralism. 7, commitment to shared values and meaning. And 8, social ties, interpersonal relationships, family, classmates, coworkers, support groups, friends, neighbors, other local associations. So who could your community be when you're thinking of it along the lines of those definitions? A group of people linked by social ties who share common perspective or interest and may also share a geographic location. Example of communities: Boston residents, potentially Brazilian immigrants, a group of primary care physicians. Communities are not homogeneous and seldom speak with a single voice. In traditional protocols, we may look at sample size and power statements, inclusion and exclusion criteria. However, when we're looking in community-based CBPR, we may also need to assess whether the right persons in the community are representing the identified community participant. It may be service providers, community leaders, additional people who are really identified with that particular group. Also to be reviewed are whether marginalized community members will be included, and if not, why not, and if yes, how? Are the recruitment strategies appropriate to the community and culturally sensitive? And who will recruit and consent? Again, this is a key question because the IRB is going to want to make sure that whoever is doing the consenting has the training to do so. What are the social mores of the community, and how does the research respect that? A quick story about that, for example, a certain small group in Hawaii population required that the researchers actually live within their particular culture for a minimum of 2 weeks before they were willing to participate in research. Unusual, but not unheard of. The nature of the power relationship. Who has control of what? For example, who is to control the data, its collection, storage, analysis, and dissemination of results? You can imagine, depending on if the data is identifiable, the IRB is going to want to know that that data is secure. Who decides on the research questions? Is the research questions being, again, evolved more in a traditional approach, or is the community involved in its development? Who approaches the community being studied and how? And how will conflict of interest issues within the community be addressed? Another key issue are risk benefits. Are there individual risks that have to be accounted for as part of the group engaging in research and for the communities? What does HIPAA mean within the context of community-based research? Are you collecting identifiable data? What does confidentiality mean within context? What data needs to be protected? How is linked and unlinked data managed? How might a community be stigmatized by research findings? Is there going to be publicity, and is it harmful? Are the community and its resources in any way being exploited? What type of education will be given to the engaged community with respect to research methods, autonomy, confidentiality, and the voluntary nature of their participation? Is the risk and burden of research equally distributed among the relevant community? Will individuals' disclosure of possible risk be allowed? By whom and how? For example, if the community is looking at known toxins related to breast cancer, do individuals receive that information, or is it presented only in the aggregate, as in the case in more traditional research? How will the results of the research be used in the community to move policy or introduce change? The final thing I want to talk about here is the consent process. And that is, again, the voluntary nature of people's participation. More often than not, researchers have a tendency to really want to push forward and provide the positive aspects of their research. Sometimes that can run into an issue with coercion. So for us as an IRB, we're going to ask some questions. How is the community told about the purpose of the study, the plan for the research, the inclusion and exclusion criteria for people's participation? Are there individual consents as well as some process for consenting the community? Is there a memorandum of understanding between the researcher and the community? Are there plans for data sharing, ownership, publication, and authorship, dissemination of findings? If there is a plan, be sure to include what it is. If there's disagreement about the study findings and interpretation of the data, how is that going to be resolved? What about future reuses of data and samples by other investigators or institutions? Is that allowed? And what is the process? Will there be incentives or reimbursement or other compensation for the community members carrying out the research, collecting data, or for collaborators? In other words, are you offering them incentives or any kind of reimbursement for travel? That has to be included in the submissions as well. So I guess the final statement I want to make here is if you were a community organization engaged with a research organization, where would you like to be in the model below? Would you like to have research done on you? Would you like to have research in? Or would you like to be participating with the researchers? So the question for you is, how does your particular research become part of this methodology of community-based participatory research? And then how do you identify the important aspects of it and make sure that everything is covered within your IRB application? The plans for us are to provide you with some of this basic knowledge and then sit down with you in order to talk about your research individually, which will happen in an upcoming meeting. So we're really looking forward to sitting down, talking with you, and providing you with some insight to how you should submit your protocol to the IRB.